I live on the kind of cul-de-sac realtors brag about in brochures. Quiet, tree-lined, no through traffic, just a loop of nearly identical single-family homes with 2 cars in each driveway and kids' bikes tossed on the lawns. I've been here almost 10 years, long enough to know everyone by first name, long enough that I can tell when something's off just by the way a porch light is left on. It's not a bad place to get stuck in a routine, and that's exactly what I had: a steady job, a small mortgage, and the kind of boring weeknights where the loudest sound is a distant TV through someone's open window. Directly across from me lives the Harris family. Mark and Denise are around my age, mid-40s, both teachers, the kind of people who wave from the mailbox and lend you sugar without making it weird. Their daughter, Emily, is 15 now, all oversized hoodies and chipped black nail polish. I've watched her grow up from a little kid on a scooter to a teenager rolling her eyes at everything, including her parents' curfew. Living across the road, you end up with a front row seat to someone else's family life, whether you want it or not. Over the years, you get used to what's normal. The way Denise always waters her front flower beds around 7 p.m. In the summer, the way Mark drags his trash can out late because he always forgets it until the last minute. The bursts of loud pop music when Emily has her friends over on weekends. It becomes background noise. Static. You tune it out. That's why when something doesn't fit that pattern, it hits you harder than it probably would anywhere else. Nothing truly bad had ever happened on our street. Car break-ins, maybe. A busted mailbox once. Kids setting off fireworks too close to the trees. We told ourselves the world was dangerous out there, on the news, in other cities. Our little bubble felt safe. I think that false sense of security is the only reason what happened that night still creeps me out as much as it does. Because it proved that sometimes the only thing between your safe little world and something truly wrong is whether or not someone notices. This was in February, a couple of winters ago, right around Valentine's Day. We'd just had a cold snap, the kind that makes the air feel thinner and sharper, and it was one of those crystal clear nights where sound carries too far. I remember checking the clock on the stove as I rinsed my plate. 11:23 p.m. I was up later than usual, halfway through some crime documentary I wasn't really paying attention to. It was a Tuesday, but everything outside already felt like 3 a.m. Through my front window, I could see the Harris house lit up more than usual. The living room lights were blazing, and every once in a while a flash of color would move across the curtains when someone held up a phone. Emily was having a sleepover. I'd seen 2 other girls get dropped off earlier that evening, all arms full of duffel bags and junk food. Every few minutes I'd hear muffled laughter carry across the street when they opened the front door to let the dog out. It was normal teen noise, annoying in the way only teen girls in a group can be, but harmless. I took my trash out late that night, mostly because I'd forgotten and trash pickup was early Wednesday mornings. I grabbed the bin, stepped onto my front porch, and the cold hit me hard enough to make my eyes water. The street was darker than usual, a few porch lights off. The sky, that weird orange-black color you get when there are clouds but no stars. Across the road, the Harris's living room window glowed like a fish tank in the dark. I could see silhouettes moving around, arms gesturing, someone holding up what looked like a phone flashlight and spinning it like a disco ball. I remember thinking how nostalgic it all felt, like some cliché from a coming-of-age movie. Suburban winter night, girls awake way past their bedtime, no real danger, just the illusion of it in ghost stories and TikTok videos. I dragged my bin back toward the house, one hand on the cold plastic handle, the other jammed in my hoodie pocket. That's when I first saw him. He was standing at the very end of the Harris's driveway, right where their concrete met the street. Not walking, not fidgeting, just standing there. He was bundled in a dark coat, hood up, hands in his pockets. From where I was, I could mostly see his profile and the angle of his shoulders, but what jumped out at me was how still he was. People waiting for rides usually pace or check their phones. He didn't. He just stared at their front windows. At first, I told myself exactly what you're probably thinking. Must be a parent. Maybe one of the girls was getting picked up late. Maybe he'd texted here and was waiting for his kid to come out. That was the rational explanation, and I clung to it. I even slowed my walk a little, hoping I'd see the front door open, a girl appear, some movement that would make his presence make sense. Nothing happened. The girls kept moving around inside, totally oblivious, shadows laughing in that oblivious teenager way. I pretended I had something to do on my porch just so I could keep watching without being obvious. I adjusted the doormat. I fussed with a dead plant. The guy didn't look over at me once. From the angle of his head, he was laser-locked on that living room window. 10 minutes passed, which feels like a long time when you're basically spying on your neighbor's driveway, and he hadn't moved an inch. That's when the excuses started to fall apart in my head. No one waits that long without at least checking their phone, especially in that cold. The longer I watched, the more wrong it felt. There was no car idling nearby, no interior light on, no evidence of anyone else coming or going. The Harris's driveway was empty except for him. The girls inside didn't have any of the nervous body language you'd expect if they were waiting to be picked up. They were just being loud, unaware. I suddenly became hyper-aware of how easy it would be, if you really wanted to just walk up to someone's house on a street like ours and stare into their life without anyone stopping you. I went back inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I turned off my TV so I could hear better and sat in the dark, watching from my front window with just the streetlight glare reflecting back at me. From there, I had a cleaner angle. The guy had shifted now, just a few slow steps, not toward the front door, but toward the side of the house where the backyard gate was. There was nothing casual about it. He wasn't lost. He wasn't knocking. He was probing the edges. My heart started doing that fast, stupid thudding thing, and I pulled my phone out before I'd fully decided what I was going to do. I actually argued with myself in my own head. Maybe you're overreacting. Maybe he's family. Maybe Mark asked a neighbor to check on the girls. But that picture of him standing in the cold, unmoving, staring at the window for almost 15 minutes wouldn't let me off the hook. I dialed non-emergency at first, then hung up and hit 911 instead. I figured if I was wrong, I'd apologize later. While the dispatcher answered and started asking questions, address, description, what I was seeing, I watched him reach the side yard. The Harris's backyard gate is one of those wooden ones that always swells in the winter. It sticks, and you really have to yank it to open it. He just stood there beside it, half in shadow, half in the streetlight spill. He's not knocking, I told the dispatcher. He's just watching them. Right as I said that, one of the living room curtains across the street shifted, just a couple inches, like someone inside had brushed it aside with 2 fingers. I saw a slice of a girl's face, pale in the lamplight, eyes scanning the street. She froze when she saw him. Even from that distance, I could tell. Her shoulders went rigid, and the curtain jerked shut like she'd yanked her hand back. The man immediately stepped backward, almost melting into the shadow between the Harris's garage and the neighbor's hedge. It was so fast, so practiced, like he'd done that exact move before. That was the moment my stomach dropped. The police got there faster than I expected, maybe 8 minutes after my call. But 8 minutes is a lifetime when you're watching a stranger lurk outside a house full of kids. By then, he was gone. No silhouette at the gate, no shape at the driveway, just tire tracks and footprints I couldn't quite make out from my window. The first cruiser rolled up with no lights, just eased to a stop in front of my house. An officer knocked on my door while his partner crossed the street toward the Harris place. I stepped outside to meet him, heart still hammering in that delayed, drained way it does after an adrenaline dump. "You're the caller?" he asked. I nodded and pointed across the street, giving him the same description I'd given the dispatcher. Height, coat, the way he'd been standing there, the slow walk toward the side yard, how he slipped into the dark when the curtain moved. The officer listened, jotting things down, but I could see that tiny skeptical flicker in his eyes, the one that says they're wondering if you just spooked yourself watching too much TV. Across the street, the other officer had knocked on the Harris's door. Denise opened it in sweatpants and a messy bun, confusion written all over her face. I watched her expression shift as the officer explained why they were there. She kept glancing over his shoulder into the dark, like she expected to see the guy appear. After a minute, Emily came into view behind her, wrapped in a blanket, her cheeks blotchy like she'd been crying. Even from my porch, I could read the guilt and fear in her body language. She knew she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to. Later, after the officers had checked around the property and circled the block with their spotlight, one of them came back to me. "We didn't find anyone," he said, which I already knew. Probably just someone cutting through. I wanted to argue, to say normal people don't stand in the freezing dark for 15 minutes staring at a living room full of teenage girls. but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just said, "Okay," and watched them drive away. The Harris's porch light stayed on the entire night. Mine did too. And for weeks afterward, every time I took the trash out or saw someone walking past after dark, I caught myself studying their posture, their pace, wondering how many other people like that man had stood just outside the circle of our porch lights, waiting for a chance no one noticed. I was 15 the winter this happened, and I have never told this story to anyone outside of my closest circle, because honestly most people would not believe it. My name is not important, but what happened that night at my friend Freya's house changed the way I look at the dark and the cold and the silence that comes with both. Freya and I had been best friends since 6th grade, and every winter break we would do a sleepover at her place because her house was bigger and her parents were pretty relaxed about letting us stay up late. Her house was one of those places that sat right on the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood where the backyards basically melted into thick, dense woods that stretched for miles. During the day, those woods looked peaceful and calm, but at night they became something else entirely. That year, 3 other girls came over too, and we had the whole upstairs to ourselves with snacks and blankets and phones and everything you would expect from a group of teenage girls during winter break. By around 11, everyone was winding down, and by midnight, the other 3 were completely passed out on the floor in sleeping bags. But Freya and I were still wide awake, sitting on her bed watching random videos on her laptop and laughing at stupid things the way you do when you are 15 and everything feels funny at midnight. Her room was at the back of the house on the 2nd floor, and had a big window that looked directly out over the backyard and into the tree line. We never thought twice about that window until that night. Freya's dog was a medium-sized mutt named Biscuit, who was usually the most lazy and unbothered animal you have ever seen. He would sleep through thunderstorms and not even flinch when you dropped something loud in the kitchen. But that night, around 12:30, he got up from his spot near the door and walked over to the window. He just stood there, staring out into the darkness with his ears pinned forward and this low, rumbling growl coming from deep in his chest. Freya looked at me and said he never does that, and I said maybe there is a raccoon or a deer or something out there. She laughed a little and said, yeah, probably just a raccoon, but her voice did not sound convinced. Biscuit did not move from that window. He just kept staring and growling, and every few seconds his body would tense up like he was watching something move out there that we could not see. I remember thinking that animals know things before we do, and whatever Biscuit was sensing, it was not a raccoon. Freya called him back to the bed, and he came, but he kept looking over his shoulder at that window, like he was afraid to turn his back on whatever was out there. I tried to focus on the video we were watching, but I could not shake the uneasy feeling that had crept into the room along with the cold draft coming off the glass. After a few more minutes of Biscuit acting strange, I finally got up and walked over to the window. Freya whispered, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I just want to look." I pulled the blinds apart just enough to see through, and at first, everything looked normal. The backyard was covered in fresh white snow that had been falling since the afternoon, and the tree line was just a dark wall of shadows maybe 40 feet from the house. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints in the snow. They started from the edge of the woods and came in a straight line directly toward the house, stopping right below Freya's bedroom window. I told Freya to come look, and she did, and we both just stood there staring at these prints that had no business being there. The weird part was there were no footprints leading away. Whoever made them had walked straight to our window and then just stopped. Freya said maybe they were from earlier in the day, but we both knew the snow had been falling fresh for hours, and these prints looked new and sharp and defined. I said, "Freya, those are not old prints," and she said, "I know," and we just looked at each other in the dim light of her room with this growing sense that something was very wrong. We were about to wake her parents when we heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the wooden deck below us. Not fast, not panicked, just steady, like someone casually walking around the outside of the house in the middle of the night during a snowstorm. Freya grabbed my arm and whispered, "Do you hear that?" And I could barely nod because my whole body had gone rigid. The footsteps moved along the side of the house and then stopped directly below our window. Freya fumbled with her phone and texted her mom, but her parents were asleep on the completely opposite end of the house and did not respond right away. Then came the tapping. 3 slow taps on the glass of the window directly below us on the 1st floor. Not loud, not aggressive, just soft and patient, like whoever was out there was testing the glass or letting us know they were there. I whispered to Freya, "We need to call the police," and she whispered back and say, "What, that someone is tapping on our window." We sat frozen on her bed, holding on to each other and barely breathing, and after what felt like an eternity, the tapping stopped, and the footsteps moved away from the house, slowly fading into silence. We waited maybe 10 minutes before either of us had the courage to look outside again. Freya went first this time, and she pulled the blinds back and looked down into the yard. She said there is nobody there. I looked too, and she was right. The yard was empty and still, and the snow was falling softly like nothing had happened. But the footprints had changed. They were closer to the house now, much closer than before, like whoever or whatever had made them had moved while we were not watching. They still ended abruptly with no tracks leading away, and no sign of how someone could have walked up to a house and then simply vanished. We did not sleep at all for the rest of that night. We sat on her bed with every light in the room on, and Biscuit between us, who had finally stopped growling and just lay there with wide open eyes like he was standing guard. When the sun came up, we went outside with her dad to show him the footprints, and the yard was completely untouched. Fresh, smooth snow covered everything. No prints, no tracks, no marks of any kind. Her dad looked at us like we were being dramatic teenage girls and said we probably dreamed it or scared ourselves with too many horror videos. But Freya and I knew what we saw and what we heard, and we never stayed in that room again during winter break. Sometimes I still think about that night, and I wonder who was standing under that window in the freezing cold in the middle of the night just tapping and waiting, and what would have happened if one of us had opened it. I have gone back and forth about sharing this story for a long time, because every time I try to explain what happened that night, people either think I am making it up, or they get this uncomfortable look on their face like they believe me. But wish they did not. I was 14 when this happened, and I am in my 20s now, and I still cannot sleep in an unfamiliar house without checking every door and hallway before I close my eyes. My classmate Natalie invited a few of us over for a sleepover at her house on a Friday night during the winter. Natalie and I were not super close, but we were in the same friend group, and she had been wanting to have people over for a while, so 5 of us said yes and made plans to spend the night. I remember my mom dropping me off that evening, and even she commented on the house, saying it looked like one of those old places that had been around forever. And she was right. Natalie's house was one of the oldest homes on the block, and it had this heavy, outdated feel to it, like the walls themselves had been absorbing decades of silence. The ceilings were high, and the hallways were narrow, and the wooden floors creaked with every single step no matter how carefully you walked. Natalie told us her family had lived there for over 30 years, and that her grandparents had actually owned the house before her parents took it over. She said it casually, like it was nothing special, but there was something about the way the house felt that made it seem like it was holding on to more history than anyone was willing to talk about. The 5 of us set up camp in the living room, which was a big open space near the front of the house, separated from the kitchen by a short hallway and a door that swung both ways. Natalie's parents were upstairs in their bedroom on the 2nd floor, and they told us to have fun, but to keep it down after midnight, which of course we agreed to, and of course we did not. We stayed up eating junk food and watching videos and talking about everything that felt important to a group of 14-year-old girls. By around 1 in the morning, most of the energy had burned off, and people started getting tired. 2 of the girls fell asleep first, and then Natalie dozed off on the recliner, leaving just me and another girl named Priya, still half awake on the couch. We were not really talking anymore, just lying there in the dark, scrolling on our phones with the TV on low volume. And then somewhere around 2 in the morning, I heard something that made me stop scrolling and hold my breath. It was a whisper. Not from the TV, and not from any of the girls sleeping around me. It was coming from the hallway just outside the living room door. At first, I thought maybe Natalie's mom or dad had come downstairs to check on us, and were whispering to each other, trying not to wake us up. But the voice did not sound like it was coming from a normal standing height. It sounded low, almost like whoever was whispering was crouched down near the floor right outside the door. I stayed completely still, and just listened, trying to make out any words, but it was too faint, like someone mumbling under their breath, in a language I could not quite catch. Then Priya sat up slowly on the couch beside me and whispered, "Do you hear that?" I nodded without saying anything, and we both just sat there frozen, staring at the door and listening. The whispering continued for maybe 10 more seconds, and then it just stopped, like someone had pressed a mute button. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound itself. Priya looked at me and said, "What was that?" And I said, "I do not know. Maybe her parents are awake." She shook her head and said that did not sound like someone talking normally, and I agreed, but I did not want to say what I was actually thinking, which was that it did not sound like it came from a person at all. After a minute of sitting there in the quiet, I got up and walked over to the living room door and slowly pulled it open. The hallway was pitch black. I could not see more than a couple feet in front of me, and the rest of the house was completely silent, like everyone and everything was holding its breath. I closed the door and told Priya it was probably nothing, and we both laid back down, but neither of us closed our eyes. About 10 minutes passed, and I was starting to think we had just spooked ourselves over nothing when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate on what I knew was the kitchen tile floor. The kitchen was just down the hallway from the living room, and the tile in there had a very distinct sound when you walked on it. You could hear every step clearly, especially in a house that quiet. The footsteps were not fast, and they were not trying to be sneaky. They were just steady, like someone calmly walking through the kitchen in the middle of the night. I sat up again and looked at Priya, and she was already sitting up too, staring at me with wide eyes. She mouthed the words, "Someone is in the kitchen," and I nodded. We both assumed it had to be one of Natalie's parents getting water or checking on something, so we just sat there waiting for the footsteps to go back upstairs. But they did not. They kept moving slowly across the kitchen tile, and then onto the hallway floor, heading in our direction. I reached over and shook Natalie awake, and she groaned and asked what was going on, and I whispered, "Someone is walking around out there." She sat up looking confused and annoyed and said, "It is probably my mom. Just ignore it." But then she grabbed her phone, and I saw her face change completely. She showed me the screen, and my stomach dropped. Her mom had texted her from upstairs 3 minutes ago saying, "Hey, are you girls the ones walking around downstairs?" And her dad had sent a separate message right after that saying, "We can hear footsteps down there, is everyone okay?" Natalie looked at me and whispered, "My parents are both upstairs, and they are asking if we are the ones making noise." None of us had left the living room. The footsteps had stopped while we were reading the messages, and for a brief moment I let myself believe that maybe whoever or whatever it was had left or gone back to wherever it came from. Natalie was texting her mom back saying, "No, we are all in the living room and none of us moved," and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely type. The other 2 girls were still asleep somehow, and Priya and I were sitting shoulder to shoulder on the couch, not moving and barely breathing. And then we heard it. The footsteps started again, but this time, they were closer. They came down the hallway slowly, one step at a time, and stopped right outside the living room door. All 3 of us were staring at that door like our lives depended on it, and the room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then the handle moved. It turned slightly, just enough for the latch to click, and all 3 of us heard it clear as day. Priya grabbed my hand so hard I thought she was going to break my fingers. Natalie whispered, "No, no, no," over and over under her breath. But the door never opened. The handle turned that small amount and then stopped, and whatever was on the other side just stood there. I could feel it. I know that sounds crazy, but I could feel a presence on the other side of that door, like the air pressure in the room had shifted. We sat like that for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. And then very slowly the handle turned back to its original position, and we heard one single footstep move away from the door, followed by nothing. Complete silence. None of us moved for the rest of the night. We stayed awake on that couch, pressed together with every light in the living room turned on, until the sun came up through the windows, and the house finally felt normal again. Natalie woke the other 2 girls up, and they had no idea anything had happened, and honestly, I almost envied them for that. In the morning, Natalie told her parents everything, and to their credit, they took it seriously. Her dad said he and her mom had heard footsteps downstairs too and assumed it was one of us, which is why they texted. But they both confirmed that neither of them had left their bedroom at any point during the night. The house had a security alarm system that included motion sensors in the hallway and kitchen, and her dad pulled up the log from the night before. There it was in black and white. The hallway motion sensor had been triggered at exactly 2:07 in the morning, which lined up perfectly with when Priya and I first heard the whispering and the footsteps. The system also had a small camera that recorded a short clip whenever motion was detected in the hallway. Natalie's dad pulled up the footage, and all of us crowded around his laptop to watch it. The clip was about 15 seconds long, and it showed the empty hallway in grainy black and white night vision. The motion sensor had clearly been triggered because the recording started automatically, but there was nothing visible in the footage. No person, no shadow, no animal, nothing. Just an empty hallway with the timestamp reading 2:07 a.m. Her dad replayed it 3 times, and each time it was the same. The sensor detected movement, but the camera captured nothing. He said it was probably a glitch in the system, maybe a bug or a draft triggering the sensor, and he seemed satisfied with that explanation. But Priya and I knew what we heard, and Natalie knew too. A glitch does not whisper outside your door. A glitch does not walk across kitchen tile with steady human footsteps. And a glitch does not reach out and turn a door handle in the middle of the night, while 5 teenage girls sit terrified on the other side. I never stayed at Natalie's house again, and we never really talked about it after that week. But sometimes late at night, when my house gets that kind of heavy silence, I think about that door handle turning, and I wonder what was standing on the other side waiting for one of us to open it. And I am so grateful that none of us did.